Hello everyone, in the next couple of weeks we are going to work on probability, and probability involves saying or calculating how likely it is that something is going to happen in the future. Now in today's lesson we are going to look at some important phrases and terms surrounding probability, and then we're going to move on to calculating the probability of some simple events as well. Now the first thing we're going to do is look at some important terms. So what I've got here is a probability scale. And I'm going to write some important words that describe how likely it is that something is going to happen, an event is going to happen. Now I'm going to start on these two ends of the probability scale. If we have an event that is definitely not going to happen, we call it an impossible event. An impossible event, there is zero chance of it happening. There is no way that it can happen. Now on the other end of the probability scale, all the way up here, we've got events that are certain to happen. So certain events are ones that are definitely 100% going to happen. Now in the middle of the probability scale, it's exactly halfway, we have events, or we have a term which is called even chance. And all that means is there is just as much chance of the event happening as not happening. So there's half a chance. And the final two phrases that I'm going to put onto this probability scale are likely events, which are on this half of the probability scale. So likely events. Now likely events are events that are where there is more chance of them happening than not happening. And on the other end of the scale, you've got unlikely events where there's more chance of it not happening. What I'd like to do is copy this probability scale down with these 5 phrases, and we'll start looking at some examples using these 5 terms. Okay, I've got 5 events here, A, B, C, D and E, so I'll just read through them really quickly. Event A is that March will follow February in 2021. Event B is rolling a 9 on a standard dice. Event C is winning the lottery this week. Event D is tossing a coin and it landing on tails. And event E is that it rains at some point during October this year. Now what we need to do is match the 5 terms on the probability scale to the 5 events that I've got on the right hand side. Now I'm going to do this one in this video, and I'd like you to copy down what I'm doing for this example. Section A on your worksheet is very much like this example. So let's have a look then. Event A is March will follow February in 2021. Now every single year March comes after February, and that's not going to change. So this event, event A, will definitely happen next year, 2021, and that means that it is a certain event. So what I'm going to do is write A for event A next to certain. Now event B is rolling a 9 on a standard dice. Well, a standard dice is between 1 and 6, so it only has the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. So there is no way that you can roll a 9 on a standard dice. So therefore we call it an impossible event. So event B will be all the way down the other end of this probability scale. Event C is winning the lottery this week. Now there's very, very, very little chance that I or somebody will win the lottery this week, but there is a very, very, very slim chance of it happening. So it's not impossible, but it is very, very unlikely. So what I'm going to do is write event C somewhere down here. So it's not impossible, but it is very, very, very unlikely to happen. Event D, tossing a coin and it landing on tails. Well, on a coin, I've got two options. I've got heads and I've got tails. So if I want it to land on tails, well, there is just as much chance of that happening than it not happening. The only two options are tails or heads. Now, because there are only two options and one of them is tails, I can say that landing on a tails, there's an even chance or half a chance of it happening. So that means that event D, tossing a coin and it landing on tails, will have an even chance right in the middle of this probability scale. And finally, event E is that it rains at some point during October this year. Now, it is very, very likely that during the whole month of October, which is in the autumn, there will be rain at some point. Now, it's not definitely going to happen, so it's not a certain event. We might get really, really fortunate and have zero rain during October, but it is very, very likely. So event E is going to be at this end of the probability scale. Now, as I mentioned earlier, section A of your worksheet for today's lesson is very similar to this, where you've been given some events and you need to say whether they're impossible, unlikely, there's an even chance, likely, or certain events. If you'd like to pause the video now, you can do that part of the worksheet before we move on. If you want to carry on watching the video and then go and do the whole worksheet later, that's absolutely fine. But I'll give you a chance now to pause the video to work on section A, and then when you're ready to move on, you can restart the video. Okay, now for the second part of this lesson, we are going to start calculating the probability of some simple events. Before we do one example, I'd like to copy down this little formula that I've got on the table in front of me. This P with event in brackets just means the probability of an event. So the probability of an event happening is calculated by thinking of the number of ways that the event can happen over or out of the total possible outcomes. I'd like you to make sure you've got this copied down, please. So if you need to pause the video to do that, that's absolutely fine. We're just going to do one example of calculating some events using this formula here. Now, I'm going to use a very popular type of question for my example, which is using coloured counters in a bag. So I've got a load of counters here, which I'm going to separate into different colours. And before we make a start on the question, I'm just going to make a note of how many of each colour I've got. So if I look at my blue counters to start off with, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 blue counters. I've got 3 green. I've got 4 orange counters and 1 purple counter. Now, a very common question that you could get given in a test or an exam is that if all of these counters were put into a bag and I was going to select one of them at random, obviously not being able to see inside, then what is the probability of me selecting, let's say, a blue counter, or the probability of me selecting a purple counter, or any of the colours? And I want you to keep this little formula that we just wrote down in mind. The probability of each colour is the number of ways that the colour can be chosen, or the way the event can happen, out of the total possible outcomes. So altogether, I have how many counters in the bag. I've got, well, 8 plus 3 plus 4 plus 1 is 16. So I've got 16 counters in this bag altogether. And my probabilities, that means, are going to be out of 16, because there are 16 in total. Okay, so if I was asked then to work out the probability of selecting a blue counter, I would write it like this. Now this means the probability of selecting a blue, or the probability of blue, equals, well, how many ways or how many different blue counters are there that I could choose in the bag? There are 8 altogether, 8 blues, out of 16 in total. So my probability is 8 out of 16. If I was asked to work out the probability of selecting a green counter, well, there are 3 green counters in the bag, so I could choose one of the 3 counters out of 16 in total. So my probability of selecting a green is 3 over 16, or 3 out of 16. The probability of me selecting an orange counter, well, there are 4 orange counters in the bag, so it would be 4 out of, or over, 16. And finally, if I was asked to work out the probability of purple, choosing a purple counter, well, there's only one purple counter, so the probability of me choosing that purple counter is just 1 out of 16 that there are altogether. Now, a quick way of me checking this, and we'll do more on this in the next lesson, is if I add up these numbers on the top of the probabilities, I've got 8 plus 3 plus 4 plus 1 gives me 16, which is a good way of checking that I've got all of my probabilities correct. They should add up to 16 altogether. So this is the only example that we are going to do for calculating simple probabilities. But the main thing you need to take away from this example is that all I did for each probability was look at the number of ways that that event could have happened, or how many of that colour counter there were, out of the total possible outcomes, or the total number of counters in the bag. And hopefully this formula here will help you with section B on today's worksheet.